While we're waiting for that, I am best known for a book called Vagabonding, An Uncommon Guide to the Art of Long-Term World Travel. And you can't get it in Kazakhstan, apparently. It's really hard. Can you get Amazon books here in Kazakhstan? Oh, there's me. That's me. Oh, perfect. Okay. So this is going to be a little encapsulation of the lessons that I teach in my book. And I think I prepared too much for this presentation, so some parts I'm going to go through very fast, some parts I'll go through slower. Who came to my workshop yesterday? Okay, there's going to be some recycling from my workshop yesterday. You'll notice I'm wearing the same shirt, right? So I recycle a lot of things. Let's talk about the art of long-term world travel, which means traveling not just for a one-week vacation, but maybe traveling for a year. Or if you don't have that much time, maybe traveling for 2 months or 5 years. So this is a picture of where I was last winter. I was in Sumatra. Sumatra is part of what country? Indonesia. And of course, like a good traveler guy, I went to the beach, right? But I didn't just go to the beach in Sumatra. I got around by motorcycle. Sometimes having your own transportation is better than just taking a bus because you can go exactly where you want to go. I also went inland to some festivals, including the Pacu Jari cow races. And in the Minangkabau part of Sumatra, they actually test the cows before they sell them by racing them across a rice paddy holding onto their tails. It's very strange and very delightful. And then I spent some time in the Mentawai Islands. This was all in January of this year with the Mentawai people, and they live a near Stone Age existence. They have a little bit of connection to the modern world, but they live in a way that is a little bit unfamiliar to us. It's a world where they don't have smartphones, they don't spend time on the internet. In this particular situation, this guy is collecting poison for hunting, for his hunting arrows. So I traveled this winter in Sumatra and experienced a way of life that I would not have experienced back home in the United States. So lesson number one from the art of long-term world travel is travel need not be expensive. And really that's the strategy. I think sometimes in the United States, maybe also in Kazakhstan, there's this idea that travel is a luxury concern. It's something that you spend a lot of money on, when in fact, travel, if you go to cheap parts of the world, doesn't need to be expensive at all. So when I was in Sumatra this year in Lake Toba, this was a beautiful hotel with a view of Lake Toba. It's a volcanic lake that's on an island, in a lake that's on an island. And I paid $12 a night for this hotel. And I was probably paying too much. I probably could have stayed in this hotel for about $8 a night. This picture that I showed you before from the beach in Sumatra, you had to go by boat to get there. It takes about an hour from the mainland. It's not on an island, but it's on a very isolated part of Sumatra with no roads going to it. $18 a day, all 3 meals included. So in Sumatra this winter, I lived for about $1,200 for all my expenses for the entire month, which if you know a city like New York, you can't pay rent for $1,200 a month. And so basically I went to a very affordable part of the world that also happened to be very fascinating. Also this winter I went to Sri Lanka and Georgia. So this is a picture from Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka I lived a more expensive lifestyle than in Sumatra. I paid $1,500 a month, which is still much, much less than would be simple rent in a city like New York or Los Angeles. So again, the secret to long-term world travel is really to spend less money by choosing carefully where you're going to go and living very simply. So second principle I'm going to talk about is don't postpone things. If you want to travel someplace, if you want to travel the world, don't wait until you think you have enough money. Don't wait until you retire. I don't know how it is in Kazakhstan, but in the United States there's this idea that travel is something that you save for when you retire, that you save for when you're old. And so when I was this guy, believe it or not, this is me 30 years ago, look how fashionable I am. I'm sure this is coming back. The mullet haircut and the Cosby Show sweater, I'm sure will come back eventually. I was of the belief that travel is something maybe you did after a life of work. Like you turned 60 or 65 or 70 and then you had time to travel. But my grandfather was a Kansas farmer in the United States. When he retired, my grandmother had dementia. She had Alzheimer's disease. He didn't get to enjoy his retirement like he thought he might. And so that was sort of a sad way for me to learn a lesson that if you want to do something like travel the world, you should do it as soon as you have the opportunity to do it. So exactly 25 years ago, I started traveling around the United States by van. I didn't even think to go international, and I've met some Kazakhs here who've done their first vagabonding trip in Kazakhstan, maybe Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. Start local, it's a good way to go. So I traveled the United States, I lived in a van. I was able to travel, and again, this is 25 years ago, for $650 a month. I paid $650 a month to travel the United States, living in a van, eating rice and ramen noodles every day, and having this amazing time of my life. With my best friend Jeff, he's the guy who's pictured next to me in this picture. At the time in 1994, it was really before there was much internet, and I thought I was doing something completely new, but now they have what's called hashtag van life. Has anybody heard of hashtag van life on Instagram? It's basically these very fashionable people, a lot of them American. They kit out a van and they broadcast their life of how simple they're living and how luxurious they're living and how good looking they are, right? And that's fine, but oftentimes they say that van life stereotypes are not necessarily true. They only talk about the good things and not necessarily the bad times. Well, I'm here to say that van life is very doable, that long-term travel is very doable. You just have to realize that sometimes it's not easy and sometimes you don't live in a luxury environment. And another thing to keep in mind in terms of travel as we see it on Instagram, for example, versus travel in real life, is that it's not a contest. It's not a contest to see who travels the most. It's not a contest to see who travels the longest, necessarily. So 25 years after my first vagabonding trip, I'm still traveling. This is a picture of me riding a motorcycle through Sumatra this winter. But my friend Jeff, who I traveled with 25 years ago, he has a pretty normal life. He works for Microsoft now. He has a family. This is him and his wife and his daughters. And that's fine. It's not like I won travel and he didn't. He lives a normal life. But that 8 months that he traveled with me in 1994 changed his life, and it enriched his life in a way that makes his family life even better. So I'm not saying that everybody has to be a vagabond their whole life. I'm saying that let travel enhance your life in a way that's unique to yourself. So this is a picture of me in South Africa a few years ago. And even though it looks kind of cool and glamorous to be drinking a beer in a plunge pool, it's not a contest, and really let travel serve your own interests. 2, travel starts at home. Oftentimes there's this idea that you have to have a whole lot of money to travel, when in fact the best way to travel is just to manage your expenses in such a way that you have enough money left over. Instead of buying coffee out every day, make your own coffee. I don't live in a very fashionable part of the United States. I spend a lot of time in New York and Los Angeles, but I live in Kansas. Has anybody heard of Kansas? A few people. It's not very famous. It's sort of an agricultural place. I think it's pretty there, but it's cheap. My family is there. They're nearby. And instead of having to pay $2,500 a month rent in New York, I can live for free in my own house that I've already paid off, because it's much, much cheaper than other parts of the United States. So this is a principle that's very important that I talk about in my book, Vagabonding, that time is your purest form of wealth. That oftentimes, especially in the United States, we think, oh, if I have money, I'm going to buy things. I'm going to make myself happy by buying lots of things. Actually, I don't think that's true. If you have money, invest your money in such a way that it gives you a wealth of time. Even if you're not a traveler, even if you just like to spend time with your family or spend time with your hobbies, spend your money in such a way that you can create more time for yourself. And really that's something that starts at home. So when I go to a beautiful place like Iceland, this is a picture of me in Iceland from a few years ago, what affords me a chance to go to these beautiful places is the simplicity with which I live when I'm at home. Oftentimes that simplicity means not going out to eat every day, but cooking my own food, foregoing expenses that might have made my life interesting at home, but sometimes it's going to be more interesting when you travel. Also, I'm a journalist. I'm not a rich guy. I'm a travel writer. It's a glamorous profession, but I don't make a lot of money through travel writing. It's really not the money I make, but the money I save by living a very simple and frugal life back home that allows me to travel. Another thing to keep in mind is to take it slow. If you were here yesterday, you saw some of these pictures, so this is one part I'll fast forward through. But keep in mind that when you go to a bucket list destination, we all know what a bucket list is. It has to do with the American idiom, when you kick the bucket, you die, right? So a bucket list is the places you want to see before you die. Most bucket list places you go to, like this place, which is where? Machu Picchu, are full of other tourists, exactly like you. So keep in mind that a bucket list is best when it gets you out the door. because the things you discover on the way to your bucket list destinations are going to be far more interesting than what you see at your bucket list destinations. For example, Iceland, which is a country I only went to for the first time a few years ago, is a beautiful place for nature with lots of waterfalls. But its most famous waterfalls are sort of like the Eiffel Tower now. You know, they're sort of like Times Square. A lot of tourists come there, and in fact, Chinese tourists, Chinese brides, as you see in this picture, will travel to Iceland for like 3 days to get their wedding photos taken in all the beautiful parts of Iceland, which is fine, but it means if you go to just the obvious bucket list places, you're going to miss the cool parts of Iceland. So get off the beaten path. Any place you go, just walk for 10 minutes away from the bucket list place. What you'll find is just as interesting as other places. And so in Iceland, I did a lot of hiking. I found a lot of waterfalls that are not famous, but I had a great time where I didn't have to stand in line behind somebody taking a wedding photo. And so walking is always a great place, going slow, not necessarily finding what you thought you wanted to see, but just walking through a place until it becomes interesting, going very slowly. We talk oftentimes about optimizing efficiency in business. Well, in travel, don't worry about optimizing efficiency, just go slow. When I was in Myanmar, I went from the city of Pukoku to the city of Yangon through the slowest boat in the world. I could have gone on a bus, it would have gotten me there in 6 hours. This boat took me about 2 or 3 days. But I learned so much about Myanmar by going on the slowest boat in Myanmar. So don't worry about being efficient when you travel. Go slow, find out what the country has to offer you. And number 6, walk until your day becomes interesting. I think sometimes we get nervous about what we're supposed to do in countries. I say just walk until you find something that you find interesting. For example, when I was in Morocco about 10 years ago, I wanted to go to a place called Chefchaouen. Has anybody heard of Chefchaouen? It's the Blue City. Joni Mitchell wrote an album about it. And so I went to a taxi driver at the port, and I said, I want to go to Chefchaouen. I didn't know how to pronounce it yet. And he said, Tetuan? And I thought, okay, yeah, I guess. Well, Tetuan is another city, right? It's not Chefchaouen, it's Chefchaouen. He took me to Tetuan. And so I came to the wrong city, and I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to walk until this city becomes interesting. It was market day. A lot of Berber people were selling things from the town. And it was an amazing city that I had no idea that I went to by accident, but it was an amazing time just because I walked until my day became interesting. This picture is actually from Sudan. And sometimes, you know, it's good to go to a country and visit the people who live there. But in Sudan, these days, in Syria is a country that's famous for refugees. There's been war in Syria for a long time. There's refugees going all over the world. When I was in Syria 20 years ago, Syria was taking in refugees. These people are from Sudan. And I was walking through the church, and I heard this great gospel music. It sounded like American gospel music, and I thought, that's strange. So I walked into the church. It wasn't Americans. It was Sudanese Christians singing songs. I hung out with them for a day. I didn't learn much about Syria, but I learned a lot about Sudan while I was in Syria, simply because I walked because the day became interesting. Same in Sumatra this winter. I met these people by hiking into the jungle. There's no roads on Mentawai Island. Even the rivers don't go very far into the island, so you have to walk through the mud for a day to find the people that are interesting to meet, but it's worth it. I had the most amazing time in the Mentawai Islands this winter. Number 7, don't set limits. Again, this is something I talked about yesterday. This is in Myanmar, in Southeast Asia. Often you have a stereotype, sort of a National Geographic stereotype of what you're supposed to see. But as I said yesterday, I found this in Thailand, a cowboy ranch, sort of a Kansas-style cowboy ranch that's not for American tourists, it's for Thai tourists in Thailand. And then you can learn something by going to the counterintuitive places. And as I said yesterday, I learned the bagpipes when I was in, where? Cuba, right? Yeah, not Scotland, but Cuba. And I made a bunch of Cuban friends, and when they came to Canada and I hung out with them, the most interesting thing that they found in Canada was not the waterfalls or the beautiful leaves of Nova Scotia, but Walmart, because they don't have Walmarts in Cuba, right? Consumer culture was the most fascinating thing that my Cuban friends found. And they were great people, and it was fun to travel through their eyes. Number 8, it's okay to make mistakes. One thing about travel is that by definition, you're always somebody who's in a place that is not your home, right? You're in somebody else's home. You're not an expert. You're naturally going to make some mistakes. Like this, in Namibia, I traveled up the Skeleton Coast. I probably should have rented a Jeep, but I was cheap. I rented like a little Kia car, and I blew out the wheel, like more than once. But that made it interesting. It gave me a pretext to stop and get out of the car and talk to Namibian people. And even though it was sort of embarrassing, my trip became more interesting because I made mistakes. This is from actually Sri Lanka this winter. I showed a picture of me riding a motorcycle. And I just want to say that there's a lot of worries that people have about travel. It's usually, I'm afraid, I'm going to get robbed, or there's going to be terrorism, or there's going to be some sort of crime that's going to happen to me. The two things that most often happen to travelers when they're traveling are, one, something bad happens to them in the water, or two, they rent a car or a motorcycle and they crash it. So I crashed my motorcycle in Sri Lanka this winter. I got a black eye, and I learned a lesson, right? So just be careful when you travel. This is a mistake that could have been much worse than it was. But remember, when you rent a vehicle, that you can drive as safe as you think you will be, but that doesn't keep other people from being dangerous for you. So be careful when you're swimming and when you're renting vehicles in foreign countries. And remember, the three best things to risk in this day and age, where if in doubt you can go back to your smartphone to get so many answers: dare to be lonely, dare to be lost, and dare to be bored. Because a smartphone solves all of those problems. That we always have a map, we can always find our way with our smartphone. If we're lonely, we can always have a chat on WhatsApp with somebody back home. And if we're bored, we can just watch Netflix, right? Well, one of the gifts of travel is that travel gives you things. You don't have to just look at a phone screen, right? That travel gives you an opportunity to be lonely, lost, and bored. And I just read the other week that being lost is actually good for your brain. That it actually exercises your hypothalamus, and it will protect your brain against dementia and Alzheimer's, because you're using your brain in a non-habitual way. So don't get lost in a way that's dangerous, but be willing to get lonely, lost, and bored, and that will make your trip more interesting. Actively learn new skills. You don't just have to be a sightseer when you travel. You can learn things like merengue dance, which is something that me and my friend Jennifer from Washington, D.C. did in the Dominican Republic. This is me in New Hampshire actually learning how to cook. Find ways not just to see things when you travel, but to learn things when you travel, including other languages. I'm pretty bad at languages, but languages are a great thing to learn. I learned how to sail when I was in Greece. 10, try something different. I'm actually in this picture. Can you guess where this was? This is Brazil. This is Carnival in Rio. You can pay a lot of money. You can pay maybe $15 and see a Carnival parade, but Carnival parades actually come from the favelas, and favelas are where poor people live. Part of the way they make money for their parades is to sell costumes to foreigners. So for $200, I got a costume, and I was in a special foreigner part of the parade, and Brazilians are much better dancers than everybody else in the world. So the foreigner part of the parade was where all the bad dancers were, but we got to see the parade from inside the parade. So I was able to try something different for a little bit more money and experience Carnival in a way that was very unique to itself. Also, become an expatriate. I've met a lot of Kazakhs since I've been here who've lived in places like the United States or Russia or Sweden. That's a great experience to have. I lived in Korea, in South Korea, for 2 years, about 22, 23 years ago, and I learned so much. I was a teacher. I was an English teacher. And since I was an English teacher, I've used that skill in so many countries, like Myanmar in this picture, where I go and I just volunteer at the school. I say, hey, I'm an American. I speak English. Do you want me to talk to your students? And 100% of the time they say yes. It's sort of like being a celebrity, because people have seen Americans on TV and in the movies, but when a real American shows up and offers to teach English for a day, they let you see the place. And so I was able to visit my students befriended me, and they took me to places, and if you saw my talk yesterday, you'll know this, which is a drag cabaret, men dressed as women dancing in Myanmar in a Buddhist pagoda, which I wouldn't have seen had I just randomly been traveling through Myanmar. It was very strange, but my students took me to it, and they said, yeah, this is normal. This is a thing that happens in Myanmar sometimes. I wouldn't have discovered that had I not volunteered as a teacher. Number 11, remember the ethical dynamic of travel. There's sort of a guest-host relationship, and I think Kazakh people understand this because Kazakh people have a nomadic tradition, that you're very kind to your guests. But there's an inverse relationship, which means that when you're a guest, you should remember that you are a guest, that you are being hosted by another culture, and so you should be careful to respect another culture. So if you go to Australia, does anybody know where this is in Australia? It's Uluru, or Ayers Rock. It's right in the middle of it. It's a giant red rock right in the middle of Australia. And a lot of people will go and they will, well, actually the Pitjantjatjara Aboriginal people who live there believe it's holy, right? So they say, well, we don't go to Mecca and climb all over the mosques in Mecca. We don't go to Jerusalem and climb over the churches there. So please, when you come to Australia, don't climb on Uluru. In fact, you can see the sign that says, we don't climb, please don't climb. What do you see in the background? A bunch of people climbing Uluru, using a chain that's been supported by the National Park Service to do that. So it's a complicated relationship, the guest-host relationship, when you go to a place like this. Another thing to keep in mind in the ethical realm of travel, this is in the Omo Valley of Ethiopia, and this sort of illustrates how national customs are a complicated thing. This young woman, she's about 14. I was here 10 years ago, so now this young woman looks like this. She's a member of the Omo tribe. As part of a fertility ritual, the women's lips are severed and stretched out with clay plates as sort of a beautification ritual. There's historical factors for why they do this. It's very complicated, so that when she doesn't have her clay plate in, she looks like this. Her lip will sag beneath her chin. And this is a cultural thing that is very interesting to travelers. For example, I paid $1 for all these photos that I took, and so it's very strange how these people who are farmers can make more money getting money from tourists to take photos. And so there's sort of a problem. This is a cultural tradition, but it's also mutilating their women, right? Maybe it's a cultural tradition that it isn't voluntary for the young women it happens to. So it's very complicated, and it's perpetuated by the idea that there's a tourist economy in photographs in that place. So remember that everywhere you go, there's a complicated ethical relationship. I have 10 minutes left. I have more time than I thought I did. And 12, take the travel attitude home. We'll have some time for questions, it turns out. Take the travel attitude home. So one great thing that you learn when you travel is you have an international scope. You have an international understanding. And that's a great thing where I come from in the United States, because sometimes America is such a big and loud country that sometimes we forget to listen to other countries. So if you take the travel attitude home, you can discover your own home as if it is a foreign place. And so this is me from about 3 weeks ago, going hiking in Kansas, where I live. I'm sure there's parts of Kazakhstan that looks like this. It's a grassland. And so when I go back home, I try to remember that travel is not just something that happens in other places, that this process of curiosity and discovery is something that I can do at home as well. And not just through my hiking, but through reading. Half of my library is books about or by other cultures. And so in a way, travel is a conversation between the life we live at home and the life we live far away. Again, it's not a contest, but really it's something that once you start traveling, you can find ways to do it for the rest of your life. So that's a short version of what's contained in my book, Vagabonding. We do have time for questions. Do we have a microphone for questions? All right, we have a microphone for questions, so if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer them in the time that we have left. All right. There's several in the front row.
Hi, it was really exciting, and I'm a traveler myself, an experienced one. I have a question, and I do see whatever you said in my life as well, especially the last one, like traveling back home, because most of us haven't traveled Kazakhstan, and it's an amazing country. Actually, we have something like that, like just 6 hours from here.
Sand, desert.
Sand, yeah, it's a sinking dunes over here. Yeah, so here's my question. So what are you planning to do in Kazakhstan? Second, what was the most amazing place you have ever visited?
In the world.
In the world.
And what was the first question?
So far, I'm giving you that you are not stopping to travel,
right,
so that's going to be.
And what was the first question?
What are you planning to do in Kazakhstan? So what's the plan? How long are you around?
I have a very, very sad story about Kazakhstan. I'm leaving Kazakhstan in like 10 hours. and so I told... I agree. I completely agree. So I had a choice that I could come here for 3 days or not come at all. So I'm here for 3 days, and I'll come back. I've learned a ton about Kazakhstan just by talking to Kazakh people, and so I would like to come back. In part because I'm, like, one of my favorite places, one of the most amazing places I've been to in the world is Mongolia, which is also a sort of a Central Asian country with a nomadic tradition. So I do want to come back eventually. The question you ask is such a hard question. You know, what's the most amazing place in the world? I think every place I go I fall in love with. Like, I had several pictures from Sumatra this time. I love Sumatra so much. But there's also a lot of pictures from Iceland, which is also an island and also very different from Sumatra. I love Iceland so much. I love Patagonia. I love Brazil. I love Paris. I love New York. I love Kansas, where I live. So that's such a hard question to answer. And I think in keeping with the bucket list idea that often it isn't about the list you make, but it's about the attitude that you bring to all these places. And there's something to love about so many places. So I look forward to discovering more of Kazakhstan and figuring out what I love there.
I mean, a lot of times when you travel and move from one place to another, it's like, do you feel home somewhere? Or do you feel bad that you basically don't have home?
I'm aware some digital nomads have no home at all, and for the first 15 years of my travel career, I didn't have a home. But that picture of the house with the green grass, that's my house. I have a home in Kansas now, and my family is very close. And one thing I learned about traveling the world is that family is important in every culture in the world, right? Sometimes in America, we have weird ideas about family because we're such a modern country. But I learned in places that oftentimes families will intentionally live close together, and so I live close to my family in Kansas. So that's my home. Home is where the family is, in my heart.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question.
May I ask what is the best cities for being digital nomad, and also half of your pictures you showed us. Do you think that digital nomad also can be identified as a man who work as a teacher because it requires you to be here in that place? Yeah.
I think we actually talked about this in the digital nomad panel. Is what's the difference between a digital nomad and a freelancer and an employee of an international company? In a way, it doesn't matter, But I think living overseas is the important part. And one thing that the digital nomads have optimized is the freelance moving career. Digital nomads have jobs like designers or web tech people that allows them to use their skills from anywhere in the world. And your first question are which cities are the best?
Yeah, in terms of expenses, quality of life, and yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that you said cities, because some of my favorite places this winter, for example, were not cities. There were places in Sumatra where it was super cheap, there's good internet connections, but I pay $8 for my room instead of $50 for my room, right? So one important thing to keep in mind is that you don't necessarily have to go to cities as a digital nomad. You can go to cheap country places, and if the internet connection is good, you can do the same kind of work that you would do as a digital nomad in a city. Now, one nice thing about working in cities is that you can network, that there's other people like you. So I think it's win-win. Both of them are good for that. I would say cities in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, are pretty good for that, just because they're cheaper. The cities in Europe are going to be more expensive, and you're going to be spending all your funds. Cities in North America are the same. So I would say either go to the country. If you go to the U.S., go to my home state, go to Kansas, where it's going to be cheaper than New York, or go to a place like Indonesia or Thailand or Cambodia, where things are much cheaper, and you can get so much more experience for your money.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I'm here with a microphone.
Oh, okay, hi.
Hi. You touched briefly about the ethical tourism, that it's a complicated relationships between tourism and the local communities that depends on the profits from foreigners. And I just wanted to hear more your thoughts about it, because sometimes tourists are local communities can lie to tourists, right? Like in Thailand, there's these elephants that do all the tricks, or when tourists wash the elephants, in reality, these elephants, after tourists are done with them, they sit with the chains and bleeding, and it's terrible things happening to them. So what are your thoughts about this ethical tourism, and what is the responsibility of tourists in contributing to such kind of cruelty?
Yeah, well, one thing is that it's always been a problem, and it probably always will be a problem. So, even if we solve the elephant problem in Thailand, and there's a lot of different operations I mean, there's some ethical elephant tourism operations that don't involve chains. I went to an elephant polo match in Thailand once that's run by this corporation. But that's sort of the problem. Like sometimes we have a sentimental relationship towards animals. We want to go and interact with an elephant when in fact those elephants are being abused. Or like the example I gave of the young women in Africa, that maybe traditionally their culture is they have to sever their lips, but maybe the young girls don't want their lips to be severed. Maybe they want to have cell phones and wear jeans, right? So I think the best solution is to go slow, because if you're only visiting the place for one day, you have no idea to learn what's happening behind the tourist operation. And to listen, to ask lots of questions. And part of listening is asking questions and finding out what's really happening at a place. And even doing a little bit of research, because I think some investigation has been done against some of these unethical elephant operations, for example. But this is such a complicated issue. Like, I know that Barcelona and Venice, which are two very famous cities in Europe, are becoming very frustrated with tourists right now because so many people go to the cities. And they're renting Airbnbs, and so it's expensive for local people to get apartments because people who own apartments can make more money by renting them to tourists. So I would say everywhere you go, including Kyrgyzstan, right, remember that there's an ethical component and try to spend your money in a way that improves rather than diminishes the situation. And then as soon as you solve one problem, another problem will come up. As soon as we solve this elephant problem, some other problem could happen in the same area. So just be careful and listen and travel slow. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but that's really the best strategy we have. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. As far as we understood, you are single, and do you think that if you had a family, your own family, you will have been still traveling like this, or this is the price you paid for the style of life you are having now?
Yeah, well, I showed my friends.
Do you regret that you don't have your own family? That thing?
Yeah, sometimes, maybe. But one thing that's great about this day and age is that you can Google family vagabonding, and you can find 100 blogs of people who are traveling with their family, right? So I know people who, like families with 5 kids who travel the world with their parents. Maybe not full time, but they find ways to travel the world. Like my friend Jeff, who has 3 daughters, who I traveled with 25 years ago, he scratched his travel itch and he doesn't really feel like he needs to go vagabonding. I have some friends who have kids and they decided to save up enough money, and it's like, we're going to take the kids out of school for 1 year, we're going to homeschool them, but it's not really homeschooling, we're going to road school them for a year. And so, even though I'm not a family guy, it is possible to travel. It's not easy, it's more expensive, but it is possible to travel with your family, and it's an amazingly educational way to grow up. And again, use the same strategy. If you're traveling with your kids, go to a part of the world where it's cheaper. Go to a part of the world where there are a lot of lessons to be learned. But that's funny. I'm in my late 40s now, and sometimes I'm jealous of my friend Jeff. He has a great family. He has 3 kids. He gets to go to their sporting events. I don't have that. I've been to like 60 or 70 countries, but that's why I say that it's not a contest, right? That there's a lot of pleasure to be had in staying home and raising a family, just like there's a lot of pleasure to be had in traveling. And there's different ways to mix it up. There's different ways to be a family man and a traveling man at the same time.
I have another question.
Sure.
I mean, 2 questions, I think. So, as far as we understood, so now you live in Kansas, and I wanted to know what's next for you. What are your next plans? And I also wanted to ask you, what was the longest time of traveling for you? For how long? The longest travel you had, let's say. Yeah.
Well, I'll answer the second one first, because the first question I was thinking, I don't know. So, to answer the second question, 20 years ago, almost exactly 20 years ago, I started traveling Asia. And I traveled for 2.5 years, and when I stopped, I wrote Vagabonding. And that's the longest travel adventure I've ever had. And that's pretty long. 2.5 years is a long time to travel. But it's not a record. I've met people who've traveled 5-10 years. Again, it's not a contest. You know, I've met people who travel 5 years and are so sick of travel, you know, they just want to find a place to call home, just like I have in Kansas. And I'm not really sure what I'm going to do next. I'll stay in Kansas for a while. I live close to my family. My parents are getting older, so like this winter I might stay. My dad is going to turn 80 years old. I might stay and help him on the farm so he can stay there. But I keep wanting to have adventures, and I want to come back to Kazakhstan. So I don't know. Ask me in 2 months. I might know more what I'm going to do. But that's an advantage of this lifestyle. In my freelance lifestyle, I can sort of choose my own fate. I just happen to be at a point in my life where I'm not sure what I'm really passionate about. So I'm waiting to feel what I'm passionate about, and then I'll make a decision accordingly. How are we for time?
So,
Finished?
can I ask the last question?
Okay, I'm going to take your picture, guys. Hang on.
Rolf, may I
This
ask
is my
you
last
a
event.
final question, please?
Sure. Yeah.
There's
Oh, where's the question?
It's
one more question.
Okay.
over here. Rolf, thank you so much for your stories and everything, but are you planning to write another book? Maybe it's coming in like next year or something.
Yeah, well, this is a secret that you guys will be privy to. For years I've said I'll never write a sequel to Vagabonding, but then everybody says, when are you going to write another Vagabonding book? And so I think this winter I'll probably write Vagabonding 2, because Vagabonding is 16 years old and the world has changed a lot. And a lot of people listen on audiobooks, so I'm going to do a Vagabonding audiobook so people can get inspired to travel when they drive to and from work.
So next year, should we expect that?
Maybe, it takes a while to publish, so maybe 2 years.
All right.
2 years. I've written 4 books, but Vagabonding is my most famous one. And Vagabonding 2, wait 2 years and it'll come out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.